I would define anthropology as the science of understanding groups of humans. Now, these groups could be really wide, such as ethnic groups or special groups, or it can also be quite minute. For example, people in a certain neighborhood who like Batman, right? So it's really up to anthropologists and the context that they're willing to study as to what they describe as a culture. In general, anthropology, because anthropology studies human groups, it by definition studies human cultures. Because any group of humans, or any, even a singular human by themselves, will always create culture in their interaction with the environment around them. Be it static stuff, for example, the environment or their own thoughts, or dynamic stuff like other human beings or other animals, right? So we always create culture from within ourselves. And anthropology is not really a study of culture, but it actually is a study of how do we frame and understand culture rather than just studying it. So there are about 5 or 6 different uh, ways that anthropology helps us frame cultures, to be able to study them better and to be able to shape how we think about them. The first one is that culture is learned. It's not inherited. It's not a biological function. You learn culture by emulating the people around you. Learned especially socially. This was this contrasts with our earlier understandings of culture, sort of during the colonial era in the 1800s, where we believed culture was biologically inherent. For example, a person hailing from a certain part of the world would have traits in their personality which ascribed to that particular culture, but we now know that isn't really the case. Uh, this is where the term enculturation really comes in, which is how individuals learn culture. And anthropologists really helped shape modern understandings of identity and culture as social networks of understandings rather than innate natural ones. A second way in which anthropology can shape culture is looking at cultures as integrated systems of practices, beliefs, economics, kinship, politics, power, etc. Right? Because all of these things are interconnected into how we interact with the people around us, be it through our education systems, or political systems, or economic systems. Culture shapes how we interact with every single person we meet in our lives, either directly or indirectly. And this sort of shapes global debates on tolerance, diversity, respect for cultural differences, and so on. The third understanding of culture is called cultural relativism, which is a rather new concept. It was developed by writers such as Boas, Mead, and Benedict, which sort of shifted how anthropology understands culture. Instead of ranking societal cultures on a scale of no, this is a primitive culture or this is an advanced culture, uh, we now realize that each culture is unique in the sense that there is no primitive or there is no advanced culture. It's all concepts and contexts that we made up ourselves to sort of fulfill our own culture's relative, I want to say, strengths, not strengths, but bias, right? So modern anthropology understands cultures as their own unique little atmospheres. So where no one culture can be greater than the other, and it's no one culture is never going to be more or less advanced than another one. Another way to understand cultures is through a symbolic and meaning making understanding. So this is a more interpretive framing, which casts culture as a set of systems of symbols and meanings, and it sort of relies on the idea that rituals, texts, and practices are not just functional, but also symbolic and express deeper values within any culture. Now, these rituals do not have to be religious in nature. A ritual could be anything habitual that a culture does in order for hoping for a certain outcome.
So
For
maybe
example,
even if a certain way that a meeting is run in an organization, can that
yes,
also be a
yeah.
ritual
So,
or
for example,
symbolic?
if an organization prefers to run heavily structured agenda-based meetings, that could be seen as a ritualistic behavior of that organization, right? So, in this sense, the rituals that you design feed very heavily into the culture of the organization and how people think and behave within it, because you're also embedding power structures within that ritual, right? So someone's leading the meeting and someone's following their lead. So there's also a power dynamic that's created as part of the culture, which brings us to the next, understanding of culture, which is culture as being centered around power. Culture is heavily, heavily shaped by power, inequality, and history, especially in recent times with colonialism and the lots of discussion on decolonization within the last 50, 60 years. Culture, post-colonial anthropology, and thinkers like Bourdieu or Foucault really highlight how culture can reproduce inherent hierarchies that are present in our history, that are also present by economic, political, and social power discrepancies within any society, within any group of people. And this brings us to the last understanding, which is culture is dynamic. You know, cultures are not bound by time or space or location. Cultures are so interconnected, so you can never really isolate one culture from the other, because no individual is only part of, it's not truly part of only one culture. They generally are part of multiple cultures or subcultures, and that's what creates their personal identity. So we need to frame culture as something that is fluid, hybrid, and that is constantly renegotiated. It's shaped by ideals and concepts such as migration, like media, like transnational flows, economic power, economic disparities. And this sort of helps us contextualize modern ideas of identity, diaspora, especially in the business sense, globalization and globalized supply chains. So in this sense, yes, anthropology does help shape how we think about culture, and it sort of frames that. Can it be? It does not design culture in of itself. Anthropological concepts can be used to inform how we design our rituals, how we design symbolic items in organizations. It can be used to understand how to design other aspects of a culture, but we cannot truly design our culture per se with 100% efficacy because of the fluidity and the dynamism of culture. Because you cannot isolate a culture, right? So it always changes, and designing culture is always going to be a trial and error.
Um,
Yeah.
so based on whatever you said, so you mean to say that culture, eh, no one is part of just one culture. Everyone is part of multiple cultures and subcultures. So which means that culture can be at a team level from an organizational context. Culture can be at a group level. Culture can be at an organizational level. Culture can be at a societal level, at a national level, at a identity level, at a beliefs level, and each one of these cultures kind of interacts with each other, and that kind of forms the reality of life that we experience. Is my understanding correct in that case?
Oh, yeah. So that's exactly what our current understanding of culture leads us to believe.
Okay. And so if I have to ask you, how do you design a culture? So there is a lot of talk and a lot of discussions in leadership circles about the importance of having a culture that supports high performance, a culture that supports a specific aspect. Let's say, for example, culture that supports innovation, culture that supports execution, culture that supports creativity, culture that supports, let's say, experimentation and things like that. So, how does one go about defining these or designing these cultures in their respective teams at a team level? And what impact does that have on the higher or not higher, but on, let's say, for example, you define this culture in your team. What impact does the organizational culture have on this culture as well? So, first, how do you design this? And second, how does this interact with the overall culture that this subculture is a part of?
To be very frank, at a base, we cannot design a culture because of how dynamic and fluid it is. By definition, culture cannot be designed. What you can do is create environments and situations where you can encourage a certain culture to develop. You cannot, by design, say like, okay, we're gonna do these four things at a team level, and that will create this culture. because each team is going to be different. Each individual on each team is going to be different, and they're going to perceive and understand that environment differently. So we can just make a environment conducive to a certain culture, and then basically have to filter out, who amongst your team is conducive to that environment and that culture, and who is not. And for who are not, you have to then, rework some of your environment. That could be through language, that can be through structure. How do you organize your meetings? How do you, organize their deadlines? How do you organize their tasks, right? So there cannot, at its core, while you can have an organizational structure, culture at a large level, it is not, what's the word, duplicatable. You cannot duplicate it at a team level, at a managerial level, at a leadership level, multiple times. You know, an organizational culture is something that's built by the amalgamation of multiple cultures in multiple teams. For example, the culture you want to develop at a developer side is going to be vastly different than a culture that would work at a sales side or a marketing side or a leadership side, right? So instead of focusing on what kind of culture can we create organizationally, it's better to sort of fragment culture in an organization into different sections. For example, you can have your R&D culture, you can have your sales culture, you can have your design culture, you can have your marketing culture, you can have your leadership culture as separate entities. And that becomes easier to shape. You still can design it, but you can sort of, lead it along a certain part to a certain extent. Of course, you can take the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But there are certain things in the environment that you can change. For example, how you set up deadlines, how you set up meetings. For example, in my experience working with more creative people in marketing and design, they tend to do much better with open briefs when it comes to their tasks. They want to express their creativity, and they sort of don't like supervision as much. Whereas in more engineering and more technical fields, they want more details in terms of what is expected of them and what is expected of their tasks and the features that they're developing. So you have to really tailor your work environment for each culture to be able to sort of generate maximum efficiency from each of these departments. So I believe the thinking that you can have an organizational structure which is a certain way, I think that's flawed in of itself.